Wild Hearts review. Let's get into it. But first, let's talk about the PC performance so that I can get it out of the way and give the rest of the review as if the performance issues don't exist. So we can keep this pretty positive, not just complaining, right? Now, as of the March of 27th performance patch, PC performance seems to be decent for some and terrible for many, and that includes myself. In fact, there's no gameplay footage because after the performance patch, my game runs at about 15 frames per second with stutters. Previously the game ran just fine for me, so the performance patch essentially broke the game for me and it's unplayable now. My advice, if you're getting a game on PC, make sure you can get a refund if you need it. I don't know how refunds work on the EA app, whatever it's called, but obviously on Steam, if you only play for less than 2 hours, you can just get your refund, right? And keep that in mind, kind of just like skip past all the early stuff and see how the game runs for you. Now, I've heard console performance is much better, but don't take my word on that. But something to keep in mind. And the game does have crossplay. Now, moving on, I'm going to try to keep this pretty brief and not go too deep into detail since I can't provide any footage anyways. But generally, I'm going to assume you roughly know how the game works and plays. It's been out for a while at this point after all. First, out of 10, I'd give the game a 7.5 if we're assuming 7 is average, and 6 out of 10 if 5 is average. In other words, just slightly above average. Now, that said, in my opinion, there's only really 2 major issues really dragging this game down. And I want to talk about this first before moving on. And well, I would give it a higher rating if those 2 issues weren't ones that have kind of already been dealt with within the monster hunting genre of games. Now, the first of those issues is the camera. As it's generally way too zoomed in, especially considering how large and mobile many of the monsters are, and the camera has been a constant source of frustration. But even just a simple FOV slider, I think, would improve this a lot and make the game feel much better to play. Even better would be to also make the camera a bit more dynamic and sort of, adjust for certain monster attacks and stuff like that, right? But honestly, I think just an FOV slider would probably suffice, and again, make the game much better overall in terms of how it feels to play. Now, the second issue is the combat environments. The arenas in which you fight monsters often have very uneven terrain and also tend to have bits of an environment in the middle of the arena, from like rocks to trees to literal like broken down buildings. And this especially affects Karakuri usage, which is why I consider it such a major issue since it's such a fundamental gameplay feature. Honestly, if it just kind of got in the way of your regular standard combat, it would be an annoyance, but not such a big deal. But it really hinders the Karakuri feature, especially in certain areas. Now, and the issue is that sometimes it messes up your placement, your fusion Karakuri don't work all the time, and just generally causes a bunch of small issues when trying to use the Karakuri. Sometimes you put the Karakuri down and you try to jump onto the Karakuri to use it, and sometimes the environment will prevent you from doing so. And this is a pretty easy, obvious fix, right? Just flatten out the arenas, remove the clutter, and I guess the real problem here is that it sometimes feels more like you're fighting the environment rather than fighting the monster, which again obviously feels bad. And I can understand that the devs probably wanted more realistic combat arenas rather than just mostly flat empty circles, but there's a reason why games in the genre mostly use flat empty circles. And just like the camera issues, the solution here is straightforward. Again, just flatten it out, clean up the combat arenas. It's tried and tested by many games in the past, already solved, already dealt with, just like the camera issues. And now there are plenty of other small issues, but generally nothing else that just really drags the game down like those last 2 issues. So let's kind of shift over to some more positive things and some minor nitpicks as well. Now, the combat overall is pretty good. I like it quite a bit. Even with the camera and the environment issues, it flows well, it's responsive, it's satisfying, and generally holds up well with other games in the genre. And as a Wakaso main especially, I've certainly was very satisfied with my experience. Getting parries feels really good, especially getting multiple parries in a row. Very satisfying. But I also liked all the other weapons. Well, there weren't any weapons I didn't like at all. Obviously, some weapons I liked less. And there's also a good amount of variety in the weapon playstyles themselves as well. So there's plenty of variety in the combat. And again, it feels pretty good overall. Now, if I had one complaint about the combat, it would be that there's a lot of things that cause your character to automatically sheath your weapon. which can be really annoying sometimes, but I would kind of classify that as a minor nitpick. So overall, combat is fun and smooth and satisfying. Now, moving on to monster designs. Aesthetically, I like them a lot, actually. I know a lot of people don't like the more grounded designs and they think they're boring, but I personally like them. That's really a personal taste thing there. But the fight designs are generally pretty good. There are a couple monsters that kind of stand out with some annoying design decisions, and like, you know, many games in the genre, unfortunately hitboxes can be a little janky and not line up timing wise with the animations. But while I found certain monsters more annoying because of those issues, they didn't really drag the game down majorly for me. But, you know, definitely an issue that exists, and basically just a couple monsters that I just won't go out of my way to hunt. But overall, I like them quite a bit. Most of the fights are pretty fun, especially the new Grimstalker I liked quite a bit. Except for its water mechanic where it causes you to sheath. I mentioned that before. I don't like the auto sheathing stuff. That was the only thing I didn't really like about that fight. Overall, pretty fun. And now the last thing I want to talk about is the crafting. And my only real complaint with the crafting is that it can be pretty grindy with certain weapons. If you're, you know, knowing a pretty in-depth, you know, craft, which goes all over the crafting tree, especially with so many once per hunt materials that you need, it can be hours upon hours of grinding to make just a single weapon sometimes. And at the very least, you can get your materials back if you want to. But yeah, I like this system quite a bit. Essentially a skill tree for weapons, and it's fun to figure out what you can, you know, sort of mess around with and figure out, and what, you know, what kind of stuff you can come up with the weapon crafting. You know, there's plenty of customization there, obviously. Now, armor crafting, on the other hand, is a little simpler, but more on the basic side. But it does also allow a decent amount of customization with the human and kimono alignment system, where essentially you've got the basic armor, and some armors will have like human and kimono versions. And essentially the alignment will give you access to different skills, you know, human aligned skills and kimono aligned skills. You know, there's a bit more expression and customization there in the armor than just simply having the armors, right? But yeah, like the crafting quite a bit. Again, can be kind of grindy, but that's no real big deal, to be honest. And that's really all I wanted to talk about, to be honest, since those are the main things I care about, and honestly the only things I paid enough attention to really have a solid opinion on them. I kind of just skipped through the story, and well, I can't really play the game anymore anyways because of how bad the game runs for me now. But overall, again, like slightly above average. But I do want to mention again that if these issues weren't already sort of tried and tested and dealt with in the genre already, I would probably rate this game a little higher, maybe like an 8 or a 7, you know, on the relative scales. But again, it's not like we're reinventing the wheel here. These kind of issues really shouldn't exist in the game. They should have been dealt with already, but is what it is. But that's going to be all for this video. As always, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one.